Of chairing our Committee on Governmental Operations, State and Federal Legislation. I'd like to welcome my colleagues who have joined us this morning, our Speaker, Adrienne Adams, Councilmember Lynn Schulman, and Councilmember David Carr. Thank you each for being with us. At today's hearing, the committee will be hearing Intro 908, sponsored by our Speaker, Adrienne Adams. I would now like to turn it over to Madam Speaker for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Ressler, and good morning, everyone. We want to thank our Governmental Operations, State and Federal Legislation Committee, Chair Lincoln Ressler, for holding today's hearing on Introduction 908, my proposed legislation to require the advice and consent of the Council as part of the appointment process for 21 city agency commissioners that are not currently required to undergo this process. And thank you all who've joined us today. Advice and consent is not a new concept or practice. Since the founding of our democracy, advice and consent has been used to protect against the abuse of power within our government. This power was vested in the legislative branch of the federal government by the founders of the nation's democracy. It was intended as a safeguard and tool of good government on behalf of the people rather than any individual interest. New York State has enshrined this power in the upper body of the New York State legislature as well. Advice and consent is a powerful tool to ensure our government maintains a level of democratic accountability in support of the public interest. I believe that good government calls for us to make this authority more consistent for our local legislature in the council by expanding existing advice and consent powers to include more of the city's agency commissioners. Advice and consent ensures that city agency commissioners who control critical services that affect and determine the well-being of New Yorkers are held to the highest standards. The city charter makes it clear that commissioners are responsible to all elected officials, and the advice and consent process ensures that the mandate is met. For decades, the council has held advice and consent power related to several mayoral appointees. It includes the Commissioner of the Department of Investigation, Taxi and Limousine Commission Chair and members, and dozens of other positions on boards and commissions that influence New Yorkers' lives. Most recently, in 2019, the voters overwhelmingly approved extending our advice and consent power to the Corporation Council. The way the Council has exercised this authority has shown that we take this responsibility seriously. Our Council has approved over 35 mayoral nominees since the start of Mayor Adams' mayoralty and helped to ensure that qualified candidates are selected. Let me repeat that. Our Council has approved over 35 mayoral nominees since the start of Mayor Adams' mayoralty. Advice and consent establishes a transparent process for nominees to introduce themselves to all stakeholders and provides the public with an opportunity to engage and comment on the nominations. It maintains a focus on a nominee's ability to perform their charter-mandated responsibilities on behalf of all New Yorkers. A transparent process advances our collective goal of good government and benefits nominees by offering them an early and invaluable opportunity to earn trust and further effective governance through collaboration and communicating their expertise and qualifications. Expanding the application of advice and consent also carries the benefit of moving the appointment process out of the shadows. That is why I have introduced legislation that expands the Council's advice and consent powers to an additional 21 agency commissioners. The legislation we're considering today is incremental. It does not apply to all of the over 80 commissioner-level positions that are appointed by the mayor. However, this legislation does acknowledge that government leadership positions are an honor for accomplished public servants who are qualified to meet the challenges of their roles. This reform measure we're considering today would strengthen our city's government and representative democracy. Indeed, it would bring us into greater alignment with the processes used by many large cities across the country, as well as the state and federal governments. It would help ensure the top positions in city government remain beacons of public service. I want to be clear that this bill is certainly not about curbing the power of any particular mayor, but is instead focused on improving government. As a city, we stand to benefit from this change and will continue to work on increasing transparency and good governance regardless of who is in office at any given time. That is the way we can continue to safeguard our future and the foundation of our democracy. I look forward from hearing more from my colleagues today on the importance of expanding the powers of advice and consent. And finally, I want to thank the committee staff for putting this hearing together. And now I turn it back over to the chair. Chair Ressler.
Thank you so much, Speaker Adams, for those wise opening remarks and for this really terrific piece of legislation. The concept of checks and balances has been at the heart of American government ever since our nation was founded. In grade school, we're taught that checks and balances are embedded in the very foundation of how American government should function. Checks and balances are necessary to prevent any singular person or branch of government from holding too much power. Every branch of government is given some form of oversight by the other. The goal is for neither the executive or legislative or judicial branch to dominate our government. This simple but essential idea is fundamental to our democracy. Yet, this fundamental democratic ideal has been undermined by Mayor Adams. The city charter gives agency heads the full, quote, cognizance and control of the government, administration, and discipline of their agencies. I just want to quote the charter again because it's so important. The charter gives agency heads the, quote, full cognizance and control of the government, administration, and discipline of their agencies. But under this mayor, we've seen what can happen when dedicated professionals are prevented from doing their jobs. Commissioners have indeed been handcuffed by City Hall, unable to freely answer questions about their budgets at City Council hearings, unable to execute critical projects planned by experts at their own agencies, and even unable to meet with elected officials without the blessing of the mayor. This is not checks and balances. This is not the checks and balances that our founders envisioned and that we teach our children. It's definitely not how the government of New York City is supposed to work. The 1989 Charter Revision Commission was the last major overhaul of our city governance, and its intent was to create a strong city council and ensure government bureaucracy that is responsive to New Yorkers. Introduction 908, the legislation proposed by Speaker Adams, is a realization of that purpose. It asserts the exact role the council should play, subjecting 21 agency commissioner appointments to advice and consent of the council, providing a necessary check to ensure our government is led by competent, experienced, and ethical leaders. The advice and consent process improves accountability and strengthens New Yorkers' confidence in our public officials. This legislation will strengthen our city charter by making sure our city is run by the most qualified professionals who understand their responsibility to serve the residents of New York City and work effectively with duly elected officials like the City Council, the state legislature, and members of Congress. The proposed legislation will add to the existing 12 agencies with positions that require City Council consent, advice and consent as part of their appointment process. Many of those 12 agencies have been subject to advice and consent of the Council for nearly 50 years. It will also clarify that the procedures for vacancies will expedite the filing of open positions and formalize processes for determining interim agency leadership. Advice and consent works. It works for the 12 city agencies that already require it. It works for the state of New York, where the state Senate approves all of the governor's nominations for department heads. It works at the federal level, where the U.S. Senate is charged with approving 1,200 political appointments, including every cabinet secretary and the leaders of all federal agencies. It works in Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and other big cities where a majority of mayoral appointments are subject to the approval of their city councils. In fact, the National Civic League, founded by Theodore Roosevelt over 100 years ago, promotes advice and consent as a best practice for structuring municipal governments. Subjecting more agency heads to council review will help ensure appointees of the mayor are thoroughly vetted and meet appropriate qualifications and ethical standards. A public hearing held by the council will require the mayor's appointees to demonstrate that they are deeply knowledgeable about their agency and equipped to serve in critically important leadership positions. An advice and consent process will allow the mayor's appointees to show that they are committed to working with all relevant stakeholders, will be responsive to our diverse communities, and will fulfill their charter-mandated role to, quote, advise and assist elected officials. Any mayoral administration confident in the qualifications and character of their appointments would welcome this model. Beginning in 1853, the mayor of New York City's appointments were subject to advice and consent of the City Council. We should reestablish this practice in city government today. Advice and consent has representative democracy. It has worked well for the city in a limited scope, and it's time to expand its application to align with the broader use at the state and federal levels of government and by many other municipalities. New Yorkers can be made confident that the mayor's appointed commissioners are qualified and positioned to capably serve as leaders of our city agencies. This administration declined to show up today, though I do see the senior advisor to the mayor for intergovernmental affairs here, so perhaps Tiffany Raspberry would like to share a few words. That being said, despite the mayor publicly expressing concern about this legislation, his administration decided to not engage in good faith in the legislative process. The mayor's dismissiveness and disrespect of this city council and his administration's refusal to engage directly on the record on the speaker's legislation is disappointing. Instead, the mayor has appointed a highly questionable Charter Revision Commission, whose only real objective seems to be delaying this worthy legislation from potentially reaching the voters. In closing, I would like to thank Speaker Adams for her courageous leadership in proposing this legislation to better calibrate city government toward democratic accountability. This is a historic and significant and bold step by this city council to demonstrate the importance of strong legislative oversight for effective and good governance. I deeply appreciate her leadership of this body and of our city, especially in light of a mayor who undermines good government. With that, I'd like to thank our committee staff, Jace Reganopathy and Erica Cohen, for their hard work in preparing for this hearing, David Seitzer for impressively drafting this bill, Julia Agos, who does a great job from the Speaker's communications team, who helped us, and just my team, my awesome communications director, Neve Mooney, and Molly Haley, my chief and special counsel, who is brilliant. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues who are here with us today, Councilmember Brewer and Councilmember Powers. Thank you for joining us. We got Lynn already. And Councilmember Shulman, if I missed you earlier, thank you so much. And now we will turn it over to our first panel. I'd like to call Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause, and Jim Karras to come before us and testify. Committee Counsel. You each have 5 minutes to testify. I think Jim has some time constraints, so maybe we can let him go first, if that's okay, and we'll go from there. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Speaker Adams, Chair Ressler, and members of the Committee on Governmental Operations, State and Federal Legislation. My name is Jim Karras. It's good to be back here. Thank you for inviting me today to testify on intro number 908, which would provide for City Council advice and consent over a number of city agency heads. As you well know, there are some peculiar topics in government that are near and dear to my heart. Budgetary units of appropriation being one, but another is advice and consent. As General Counsel and Special Counsel at the City Council, as General Counsel to the Borough President, and most significantly, as the Manhattan Borough President's appointee to the 2019 Charter Revision Commission, I became very familiar with the subject of legislative advice and consent for mayoral appointees. In 2019, I was a strong proponent of subjecting the appointment of the city's Corporation Council to City Council advice and consent, a charter change that I think has greatly improved the process of selecting the city's top lawyer. I wanted to share with you 3 reasons why I think the process of appointing city commissioners can be improved by subjecting them to council advice and consent, and why arguments to the contrary really carry very little weight. And I'm going to echo a lot of what the speaker said because I think she was completely on point. First, advice and consent is a salutary check on the appointment power and has been a pillar of government in this country since its founding. Second, New York City is an outlier among the largest cities in this country in its failure to provide any role to the local legislative body in the appointment of agency heads, and therefore on its failure to provide any check on the executive. And third, the City Council has demonstrated that it has handled the limited advice and consent it currently has in a responsible manner that has improved the appointment process for those office holders. In relation to my first point on how advice and consent is a pillar of good government, a New York lawyer who is much smarter than I am observed that, quote, "It is not easy to conceive a plan better calculated than advice and consent of the Senate to promote a judicious choice of men for filling the offices of the Union." That is what Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist Paper 76 concerning presidential appointments. He pointed out that advice and consent retains all the advantages of allowing the chief executive his or her choice in appointments while putting in place a critical guardrail against potential abuse of unchecked executive power that could result in an unfit or compromised appointee. What stops the legislative branch from using advice and consent in an inappropriate manner is the fact that at no point can the legislature substitute its judgment for the executive's. Second, in regard to the use by the largest cities throughout the country of legislative advice and consent of their mayor's appointees, New York City has for too long been an outlier. Of the four most populous cities in the U.S., New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston, it appears that all but New York subject most, if not all, department heads to City Council advice and consent. The fifth largest city, Phoenix, has a completely different form of government in which all appointees are made by a city manager. However, in Phoenix, it is the City Council, which includes the mayor, which hires and fires the city manager. So New York City appears to be an outlier amongst the very largest city governments by virtue of the fact that it gives no role to its legislative branch, direct or indirect, in the appointment process of most city department heads. Our charter is missing an important check on the executive. Finally, as the Speaker said, the New York City Council has demonstrated how responsibly it has exercised the advice and consent powers that it does have. Since 2020, when the Council was overwhelmingly granted the power of advice and consent over the appointment of the Corporation Council, the Council has approved 2 out of 2 submitted candidates for the city's top lawyer job. A respected career veteran of the law department selected by Mayor de Blasio, Mayor Adams. Point that the public discussion over a potential replacement for Judge Heinz Radix is an important discussion to have. Indeed, instances where the Council currently has the power of advice and consent, the Council approves a mayoral nominee. I know that the Council's Rules Committee process is an extremely thorough one. Nominees are carefully vetted, both in terms of qualifications and potential problems and conflicts. This is exactly as it should be, and an instance serious enough provides the public with an opportunity to weigh in on them. I do not see how it could be viewed as anything but a positive for a potential commissioner to get a taste of what the representatives of the 51 council districts think their priorities in their prospective agencies should be. I am certain that Intro number 908 would improve the selection process for city agency heads by making it more robust. I urge the council to consider applying this to all agency heads. Thank you.
If committee members have any questions for him, and then we'll hear from Ms. Lerner after that, if that's okay. Madam Speaker, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Jim, it is wonderful to see you.
It's great to see you too.
We miss you, but we see that you're living your best life. So. Just a couple of questions for you. I know that you have to leave. What do you think the benefits are of executive appointments being subject to advice and consent processes, and how does the use of advice and consent impact governance? You gave us a taste of it in your statement, but just dig a little deeper for me.
Again, I think it does not, it's still going to be the mayor's choice. It is a safeguard to ensure that that person does not have some hidden conflict of interest, that that person has the qualifications to do the job. I think it has a really healthy effect on the appointment process because it should make a mayor think before appointing someone either seriously unqualified or with some hidden agenda or some hidden connection, appointing, for example, a lobbyist to something where nobody thinks a lobbyist should be, serving in that capacity. So I think it helps on the front end in tempering the mayor's choices. Then, as I said, I've seen up close and personal, and obviously, I won't divulge any information that I've seen in my role as a council lawyer for so long, but the vetting process of the Rules Committee and the Rules Committee staff is so thorough. I've seen issues come up where either the mayor's office, I'm not talking about any particular mayor, either has missed the issue or has not thought it was a big deal, and the council's vetting process uncovers the issue, either goes back to the candidate or goes back to the mayor's office, and in one form or another, that issue is generally addressed. But that's a healthy thing, and sometimes, then the third sort of prong of that is the public hearing part. And sometimes usually the nominee ends up going through, but oftentimes those issues are publicly discussed. The public is made aware of them. Sometimes a guardrail is put in place, an ethics opinion or something like that. And if the nominee proceeds, then we're all better off for it. So I really don't understand the argument in which it's a bad thing.
Thank you, Jim. As a member of the Rules Committee now for about 7 years since I've been on the council, I've been on the Rules Committee, and I've lived exactly what you just said, and seeing sometimes that things have been missed. The council has caught those things, we've talked through them in oversight, and we've moved on.
And it happens, maybe not all the time, but not infrequently either, and that's what a good process should do.
That's right. I agree. Along those lines, you said you don't know, but why would you think that New York has lagged behind other states and compared to other municipalities and New York State with regard to advice and consent?
I think perhaps because when the 1989 charter was written, there was a sense that the city was out of control and that you needed, I think perhaps some checks that might otherwise have been imposed on the mayor were left out. And I think as we've come along, I know in the 80s, early 90s, it was the council that froze property tax rates. So I think the council has grown into its powers. I think the council has demonstrated with advice and consent that it is completely responsible in the way it exercises those powers. And I think what your legislation does in moving towards where other big cities are in this country, I think, we took one step in the 2019 Charter Commission. We made the Corporation Council subject to advice and consent. I think this is a very good next step.
Thank you very much, Jim. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will just ask a question or two, and I think Councilmember Brewer has a question or two for you, and then we'll get you on your flight. Just for the record, Jim, you're one of the foremost experts on the city charter. I really enjoyed an article you wrote back in 2013 on the separation of powers in New York City. Would you mind elaborating on the record, your resume and expertise on this topic? And then just secondly, and then I'll kick it over to Councilmember Brewer, the other question I'd just like to ask is, the TLC is an agency of I don't know, 500 employees with a $60 million budget. The Department of Buildings is an agency of 1,500 plus employees, $190 million budget. It's 3 times as big. TLC chair, subject to advice and consent. DOB is not. Can you explain this? Is there kind of any rationale for why this makes sense beyond the historic composition of certain agencies? Why some positions require advice and consent and why others don't? Thank you.
I haven't, in the time I haven't really gone back and reviewed the '89 Charter Commission, although over the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time looking at those transcripts. I think the idea was that boards and commissions would be subject to advice and consent, but commission heads, agency heads, would be solely mayoral appointees. And as I said, I think the idea back then was that you needed sort of one tough person on top of everything that goes on in the city. When I argued for city council appointment, advice and consent powers over the corporation council, I pointed out that that had often been, especially during the Giuliani years, I'll say, had been subject to what I thought was an appointee, a corporation council, being too beholden to the mayor and making decisions that were sometimes legally questionable, or at least I think one of the examples I gave in the Charter Revision Commission was when the speaker, the public advocate, the Brooklyn Borough president, all of the chairs of all of the cultural institution groups, all felt that it was legally infirm and an appalling decision to pull funding from the Brooklyn Museum. Every court ended up agreeing with them, and yet the Corporation Council defended the mayor and basically against every other involved city elected official. And I think this gives, advice and consent gives the sense to those appointees. It doesn't substitute the council's judgment for the mayor. There's no mileage for the council in turning down appointees just because they have some slight disagreement with them, because the next appointee could be worse. But it gives a sense that they are accountable to more than just the mayor. They're accountable to the city as a whole and all the people in the city. And to back up and my view of this comes from 30 years as a city council lawyer, working with agencies and agency heads, as the deputy general counsel at the council, the finance counsel at the council, and then the land use director and general counsel at the borough president's office, where I was then Borough President Brewer's appointee to the 2019 Charter Commission. On that commission, I pushed hard for advice and consent over the Corporation Council, and then back at the council as general counsel and special counsel.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you very much. First of all, Alexander Hamilton, you're smarter. I know all of the descendants of Alexander Hamilton. I love them, I respect them, but you're smarter. In terms of when you were the wonderful appointee, did other suggestions come up other than Corporation Council to be part of this process, or how did Corporation Council participate? I should remember, but thought it'd be good for the public to remember too.
I think in my head, there were other potential, to take it a little bit further, but it never got to that point. It was clear that Corporation Council at that time was sort of the most significant change we could make. And both to its credit, the 2019 commission, but also making it difficult, being I want to say a real charter commission with a wide array of viewpoints. I think that charter commission had to settle on a few key changes that we could get consensus. We had appointees from every borough president. We had a public advocate appointee, we had mayoral appointees, and we had council appointees. So
It was my bill, I remember.
Yes, exactly. And it was, so that made it difficult to take on sort of huge changes. And I don't think we thought that huge changes were necessary. And the truth is, now at this point, from this vantage point of view, I don't think this is a huge change. This is a guardrail. This isn't a change to who appoints commissioners. This isn't a change to how the commissioners will function, other than that. And I think Hamilton, somewhere in that Federalist paper, says it's a quiet but important change. It's not a radical alteration. It doesn't change the appointment power. It just has a healthy effect, both as the mayor thinks about his or her selections, as the council and the public get to speak to those candidates.
Right. The other question I have, which I think you would agree, is when the public sees, X person, this is the only opportunity they would see X person. In other words, understandably, you make an appointment, nobody ever knows who that person is. Now you have a transcript, a record, a public, if anybody wants to participate in any way. Do you also agree that that gives perhaps more opportunity for that agency to even be what it could be? In other words, they have now a record of how they're going. The public sees what their taxpayer dollars are going toward, and can testify to that effect.
It's good. It's so much better to me for the public and for advocacy groups and interest groups and groups whose lives that agency is going to affect, to be able to attend a hearing or have groups that they're members in attend those hearings, raise issues. Even if the commissioner ends up in a position that's adverse to some of those groups, at least those groups have presented their views to the commissioner. It's an exchange and a more active involvement in the introduction of that commissioner to the government than having a mayor stand at a press conference and just introduce a face, which may or may not get covered by the press.
Thank you. And the other cities you mentioned, they do in fact do such processes for all of the commissioners. That's your understanding?
My understanding, and I looked at the charters over the weekend, is that most, if not all, agency heads in those cities, other than Phoenix, in which the council just appoints the city manager, go through the advice and consent process.
Thank you very much.
And you'll see there's an exhibit attached to my testimony that has links to the various city charters.
Thank you, Jim Karras. He walks rock star status. Thank you.
We really appreciate you testifying. We hope you make your flight.
Okay.
Congratulations to your nephew.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ms. Lerner, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, which is a national organization that works for efficient and inclusive representative government across the country. I'd hoped to testify first because it's really a hard act to follow Jim Karras. I cannot pretend to have the depth and breadth of experience or knowledge of New York City government. So I'm going to talk in much more general terms. We filed written testimony electronically, but I want to step back and really talk about what some of the academic and general discussions about a strong versus a weak mayor system teaches us here in New York. And I do want to preface my remarks by saying I am not really focused on any one mayor or any one administration, because I think the strengths and weaknesses of a strong mayor system, as we have, as Jim points out, pretty much on steroids here in New York City, would be obvious to any New York City resident, and you can pick examples from any of our past mayors in the last 20 or 30 years. So the advantage to a strong mayor system is we are a large city with a lot of complex issues, and a strong mayor gives us guidance. I think in 1989, with the sudden unconstitutionality of the Board of Estimate, there was a desire to have clarity and to institute a strong mayor system. But I think we've gone too far in that direction, and what this measure seeks to do is to rebalance. We are not suggesting a so-called weak mayor system. This measure doesn't supplant the mayor's appointment process. This doesn't replace the mayor with a city manager like you have in approximately 40% of New York cities, not New York, but national cities. But it addresses the weaknesses of a strong mayor system. And one of the, I think, most salient weaknesses of a strong mayor system is that it gives too much influence to special interests, whether those are special interests who have a lot of money, whether it's special interests who have political power, whether they are special interests who are loyal to a particular individual mayor. It basically allows a small group of highly influential people to influence the mayor to get policies passed which may not be reflective of the desires of the vast majority of New Yorkers, but reflect the interests of a much smaller group. A second problem that we see with a strong mayor system is that frequently, not well, but on occasion, what we can see is that the choice of who to appoint is not based on professional qualifications, but rather it would be based on political support or other factors than professional qualifications. So rather than looking at the relevant experience or expertise, it's more, what does this particular appointment bring to me, the mayor, in my political life, in insulating me from challenges or ensuring that there won't be pushback on particular policies that I want to push because of that small group that I talked about earlier. And its third problematic factor is that it tends to overspeak the diverse voices of neighborhoods and different groups in our community, which are represented by the diversity of our city council. And it allows the mayor to ignore those voices, listening again to a small group of influencers for money or political power, and not be as responsive to the varying different requirements and needs of the communities. So having to have more of an advise and consent function brings the mayor into more dialogue with the council. The council is much more representative of the diversity of our city and the various needs of the communities, and all of us are benefited when the mayor and the council collaborate to develop the strongest possible policies and to choose the people who have the best professional qualifications to handle, as Chairman Ressler pointed out, departments that have hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, departments that have an extraordinary impact on literally the life and death of New York City residents. So to the extent that we can encourage all of our elected representatives to work together to build a consensus to represent all of the needs of the people of New York City, we will be stronger and better as a city. That's why we support 908. But I do want to say that while we support 908 and we think this is a very reasonable number of offices to be subjected to advise and consent, we would urge you to shorten the time frame. The advise and consent process is important, but so is the appointment of people who, as you point out, control hundreds of millions of dollars and the lives and livelihoods and well-being of New Yorkers. So our suggestion is hold yourself to a tight schedule. Revise so that you have 30 days for hearing and 60 days to vote, because these are important appointments and they should be addressed quickly. The public should hear what the concerns are, and if there is a problem with the nominee, they should be up for a quick vote, and if they need to be replaced, then that should happen quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lerner, for that testimony. I'd like to pass it to Speaker Adrienne Adams.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. It's good to see you, Ms. Lerner. Welcome.
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions for you, because you've been doing this for a long time as well, so don't shortchange yourself when it comes to Jim now, okay? Just a couple of questions. Do you anticipate that requiring advice and consent of the council would change who any mayor nominates for any of the commissioner positions?
I would hope that it would. I would hope that it would influence a mayor, any mayor, to take a longer look at the professional qualifications of the person who is appointed and be less influenced by what they could bring him or her politically. So yes, I think it should have a salutary impact by ensuring more qualified nominees.
Do you see any downside to putting forth advice and consent? And would you welcome even the extension of more commissioners added?
The only downside I see is if it takes too long. That's why we suggested shortening the time frame. But I think that it strengthens both the council and the mayor. I think it urges the mayor to make better appointments. I think it places the council in more of a consensus-building communication with the mayor, and I think that it is a strong net positive for our city.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I like to hear, and I think that we need to continue to stress that this is not about taking power away from a mayor at all, but it's more about, really about the collaborative process and making sure that we're getting the right folks into these positions.
Exactly. I think all New Yorkers want to see collaboration between the mayor and the council. We all want the best thinking and the development of the policies that are going to strengthen our city and solve our problems.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lerner. I'll pass it to Councilmember Carr.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank you and the Speaker for having probably what is, to me, the most interesting hearing we've had since the 2008 term limits debate in this body. And it's a matter of great weight and importance that we're considering today. I'm thinking a lot about the history of municipal government in New York. And in many ways, we had earned the moniker the ungovernable city in times past. And I think it was alluded earlier that the '89 charter revision was in many ways a rebuttal to that charge. And we have a strong mayor-council system for a reason. It's intentionally tilted towards the other side of the building. And the question that I'm kind of posing to the public, and the one that I'm certainly going to be posing to myself as I consider this piece of legislation, is not whether advice and consent is a good idea in the abstract, but whether it's a good idea to introduce it into a system that's already been functioning for some time beyond the scope that it currently has. Of misgovernance and a lack of faith in our governing institutions from times in the not too distant past. But it also calls to mind that we're considering this piece of legislation in a vacuum, right? Power dynamics are much more complicated than simply the advice and consent issue. And so I'm concerned that as we pull one string out of the shirt of city government, so to speak, we don't necessarily know where it leads, and this is profoundly consequential. And the other piece that I'm very mindful of right now is my constituents, outer neighborhoods of the most outer boroughs, are not so much concerned with the dynamic of power between one side of this building and the other. They're concerned with the accumulation of power in this building, period. And there are questions that I ask, which is why do land use issues end with the council and not with the borough boards? Why are our borough commissioners not appointed by our borough presidents rather than by the heads of our mayoral agencies? These are the questions that I wish we would get into, and I'm not sure that we'll be able to in this hearing, and I don't think we're going to be able to in the Charter Revision Commission that's been assembled, because I don't think that's the point. And for me, what I'd really love to see as we look at the charter more closely is a renegotiation and a diffusion of power away from this place and into the boroughs that we represent. And that's really the thing that's most concerning to me as a Staten Island and Southwest Brooklyn representative.
Well,
Thank you, Chair.
You know, council member, I would refer back to what I said earlier, which is one of the weaknesses of a strong mayor system is that it allows one elected official to ignore the neighborhoods and the boroughs that have a difference of opinion. And so an advise and consent system is, I would say, the most mild form of rebalancing because, as has been pointed out, the mayor still gets his or her choices for agency heads, but it allows the consideration of your constituents to actually be addressed in the confirmation process, which may not happen at all when the mayor chooses somebody perhaps because of political affiliation, because of influence in an important industry, and can overlook the concerns of your constituents. So I would suggest that this measure addresses one of your concerns.
If I could just respond briefly, Chair. I think that that has the potential to, right? But I'm not sure that's always going to be the case. Oftentimes, agencies come to my district in response to local laws passed by the council that mandate that they do particular things. So I'm not sure that it's always just the mayor, right, with this accumulation of power who's imposing his or her vision on a particular borough or neighborhood. I think oftentimes we overlook how much the two sides of City Hall often agree on things, and to me, the only check on that is borough power. And that's something we've not considered, and over the course of our history as a city, from consolidation in 1898, we've seen more and more power taken from the boroughs and brought here into the mayor council together as an operating in tandem, or the board of estimate before that.
But I would suggest that in an open confirmation process, there is more opportunity for the boroughs and their concerns to be heard. And I'm sure we can agree that in any human system, there's not 100% perfection no matter what.
Without a doubt, certainly not in government. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Carr. Just to elaborate on, I think, part of that back and forth, inherently, the council is a more representative body of New Yorkers than any one person can be. And this is, proudly the most diverse council in the history of New York City. Do you therefore believe, or could you kind of elaborate on how an advice and consent process ensures that the diversity of perspectives inform that we have qualified, ethical, and competent candidates serving in these critical positions?
Well, I'd also like to point out that I think our city council may be the largest city council. Yes, we are the largest city, but we have an unusually large and diverse representative city council. And that means that there are many more viewpoints from, Councilmember Carr's constituents to Councilmember Brewer's constituents and everything in between. So that an open process with council input means to me that we address one of the weaknesses of a strong mayor system, which is not enough attention to the different concerns of a lot of different communities and diverse needs. And this open process allows 51 representatives from very different communities to reflect the concerns of their communities, educate, as I think Jim Karras pointed out, the nominee to more diverse concerns than they might be aware of if they are simply handpicked by the mayor and rubber stamped at a press conference.
The National Civic League includes advice and consent as part of their model city charter. They note that, quote, the professional qualifications of the person selected may be higher if the council has to approve the choice.
Exactly.
The mayor is not free to simply choose a person to advance his or her electoral interests. What do you think of this rationale? Do you believe that advice and consent reduces the possibility of political patronage and selection of political loyalists to these influential positions?
Well, that's the goal. I mean, as Speaker Adams asked it, I think that it would help in that regard. I really do. The more discussion of a person's qualifications, the more an appointing authority knows that the qualifications are going to be not only vetted behind closed doors by council members, but discussed in open hearings with members of the public, advocates for different communities, that it really encourages a more professionalized qualification goal than if you're able to pick somebody because they're close to me or because they are the favorite of a particular power center that you want to be sure is on your side in your reelection.
And if I may, on a, I think, related topic, I'd just like to ask you your insight and expertise on the Charter Revision Commission that's been recently appointed. In your long expertise as a good government leader in New York City, can you recall a Charter Revision Commission being convened so late in the year? Announced on May 22nd, its first meeting today, May 29th. Do you think it's possible for there to be meaningful public engagement and input in just a matter of weeks before they need to develop language to appear on the ballot?
It's interesting that you raised exactly those questions because that is something we at Common Cause have discussed, and we put out a statement today where basically we don't want to anticipate failure of any commission, but what we hope to see is a commission that will rise to the high standards of previous commissions, and that means holding hearings in every single borough, hearing from the public, and releasing thorough and thoughtfully researched staff recommendations. It's less important to us who the staff is. It's the willingness to really dig into the issues, to look across the country, to find good models, and to provide the commissioners with a thorough, thoughtful, and neutral analysis of different proposals. And I think that that can be accomplished by any commission and any staff if that's what they set out to do. And it's our expectation that this commission will rise to that standard.
Wonderful. Well, we greatly appreciate your testimony today. If there aren't any additional questions, thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Lerner. We really appreciate it. I'd like to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Councilmember Gingenero from Queens, and would like to invite the next panel to come before us to testify. We are joined by our former public advocate and the director of Citizens Union, Betsy Gottbaum, former Assembly member Adam Clayton Powell, and Louis Holden Brown. You're awfully free to come up and testify. Ms. Gottbaum, if you'd like to begin. Thank you so much.
Press the button. Okay. Good morning, and good morning, Madam Speaker. Well, Councilmember Gianaris, long time no see. Councilmember Schulman, congratulations. I haven't seen you since you've been a council member. And Councilmember Ressler. Good morning. I'm here to testify basically from the good government aspect. I do not want to show any preference to the mayor's side or the council side, with all respect to the speaker. This is a very personal analysis of my experience having been Parks Commissioner and public advocate. And I do feel one thing quite strongly from the good government aspect, and that is that we, as an organization, Citizens Union, did not have the time to come up with a policy. We have a process which would take quite a while to come up with, are we for it or against it? And we did not have time to do that. So Citizens Union has no stand at this point. I think you probably know in the past what we have been for and what we've been against. We certainly were for the advise and consent on the Department of Investigations and the Corporation Council. And I actually totally believe we should also have advise and consent on the police commissioner, just because of the range and what. But there are other offices which I do not think that this proposal would be particularly useful. And I hate to disagree with my colleague Susan Lerner, but I just want to point out now having the Parks Commissioner hat on, that, you know, there are many, many passionate park people in this city, and they're certainly many. Once people know that they have the possibility of entering into some kind of consent, you will have such chaos and it'll take so long. And I read that you would have a deputy commissioner who would be running the agency while this process was going on. Who would appoint that deputy commissioner? Would it be the old deputy commissioner from the old commissioners organization, or would it be somebody else? So I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration very seriously. Who would appoint the deputy commissioner running that agency during this process? And I repeat, the process in parks would be unbelievable. The people are very passionate, they're very knowledgeable, but they are very strong. And once they know that they have a chance to be heard, they will be heard, and it'll take a long time. So I do believe that this process should not be rushed, and that time should be given to look at what are the various problems and consequences of this kind of, on specific agencies, by the way. And I also believe that, as I've said, that the commissioners included in this bill deserves much more scrutiny. There's quite a difference between a parks commissioner and, say, the buildings commissioner. And I think those things have to be taken into consideration in doing this. We do support, and we did support, the Corporation Council being subject to advice and consent, because that officer represents both the mayor and the council. And the Commissioner of Investigation is subject to advice and consent, we believed, because they must be independent to conduct oversight of city government. The commissioners proposed in this bill do not necessarily fall into that category. As I said before, Citizens Union does support making the police commissioner subject to the advice and consent of the council because of the unique role it serves in the status of the New York City Police Department in city government. And I just want to say that I am afraid that this particular bill will diminish the power of the mayor, and I'm not so sure we don't need a strong mayor with good oversight by the council. And I think that's one of the things that we have to really push, is for good oversight of all of these issues by the city council. On that, I conclude.
I'm going to take a point of privilege just to clarify a couple things that have been mentioned in testimony to make sure that they are accurately reflected on the record. The proposed legislation by the Speaker would give the council just a 30-day time frame to review and approve an appointment after it is received by the council or the appointment takes effect. So that is the current timeline for advice and consent appointments to the council, and that would be the timeline under consideration for these additional appointments. Secondly, if a vacancy occurs at an agency, the agency head, the first deputy commissioner would become the interim agency head. If that position does not exist at the agency, then the commissioner's designee would become the interim commissioner, or the designee of the mayor if the commissioner failed to make a designation. The commission, and from there, we would seek the mayor to make an appointment in an aggressive time frame for us to review it and approve it. That's what's proposed in this legislation, and just want to make sure that that's clearly understood on the record. Former Assembly Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Speaker, other members of the City Council. Besides being a former Assembly member, I also served as a council member back in the day between 1991 and 1997, representing parts of Northern Manhattan and the Bronx. In the relationship between the City Council and the mayor's side has always been somewhat adversarial, contentious, if you will. Even with David Dinkins, as much of a gentleman as he was, it just goes with the territory. I also served as City Council when Giuliani was elected. Oof, was that contentious? Some of you may not believe what I'm about to say, but there was a time when Giuliani told his commissioners that they could not speak to City Council members. Yes, that is correct. City Council members could not speak to the commissioners or top-level staff in the mayor's side. This didn't last very long, but it went on for a couple of months, and obviously not conducive to being productive. This is just not practical. Advice and consent can take weeks, if not months sometimes. During the pandemic, the Department of Health and Bill de Blasio was able, then Mayor Bill de Blasio was able to replace that quickly. Imagine what would have happened if the Department of Health position, the Commissioner of the Department of Health, would have remained vacant for weeks or months during the pandemic. I've heard some references been made to oversight in Congress and historical oversight in other cities, but reality is that making New York City like Washington is a recipe for gridlock. And may I also go back in history, it was tried in 1884, New York City, tried in 1884, a system where city legislators confirm mayoral appointments, but it failed. And that's why for 140 years, the mayor of the city of New York has had sole authority to make these appointments. The reality is that, again, it's not practical. We don't need another level of bureaucracy. We need a streamlined process. And imagine if at some point you, as a city council member, were required to have advice and consent of your local community board, for example, to appoint your chief of staff, or your local development corporation, LDC, to appoint your legislative liaison. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense, and it would not be practical, because at the end of the day, it's your name that appears on that ballot. And at the end of the day, it's the mayor's name that appears on the ballot, and it's the mayor's and the productivity and the constituent services would be the ones that demanded by the mayor. And having, for example, a commissioner of housing, you cannot tell the mayor who to appoint or not to appoint, and then expect them to do a good job when it comes to services in the housing industry, and so on and so forth with most other city agencies. So I would think that this is not, in good conscience, a fair bill. I would think we need to streamline government, not add another level of bureaucracy. Thank you.
Okay. I would like to acknowledge we've been joined by Bay Academy from Brooklyn, who I believe came in second place in the New York State Science Olympiad. So congratulations, and thank you for joining us. We really are thrilled that you're with us today at the council. And thank you, Adam Clayton Powell IV, for your testimony. Now, Lewis Holden Brown.
Great. Good morning, Chair Ressler, Madam Speaker.
And if I may, I just want to acknowledge colleagues, Councilmember Shahan Hanif and Councilmember Palladino have joined us this morning. Thank you for being with us. And of course, we're joined by our great public advocate, Jumaane Williams,
who I was about to recognize, and all the other council members and from the committee and otherwise. Thank you for the invitation to testify. For the sake of the record, I'm Lewis Holden Brown, and I'm appearing in my personal capacity. As you well know, I had the privilege to previously serve as deputy counsel to the previous council speaker, author of the 2021 introduction pertaining to the police commissioner appointment, and work on the 2019 Charter Revision Commission, which proposed the question requiring advice and consent for the Corp Council. While I'm a professed proponent of advice and consent, my oral summary and my longer written remarks focus on earlier history and the murky history of the council's pursuit of confirmatory powers. So New York was actually the second state to implement advice and consent in 1777, but actually abolished it in 1821, didn't bring it back until the late 1890s, and it didn't take its current form until 1925. And so that's why at the consolidation of the city in 1898, it was not an issue for consideration by that Charter Revision Commission, though the city of New York, that was then just Manhattan and the Bronx, had indeed exercised advice and consent via the Board of Aldermen from 1857 to 1884. That did not begin piecemeal restoration until the 1970s, though the City Council had actually been fighting for advice and consent as early as 1966. But the Corp Council continually took the position that the 1936 commissions and the 1961 commission had well considered their decision to not grant that power and should not be disturbed. Indeed, the councils actually gave itself its first confirmatory power in 1971. Both the Taxi Limousine Commission and the Environmental Control Board were created by council legislation that had the mayor's support, but it was not subject to referendum, and neither imposed a time limit on council's review. In 1975 was when the council was given the power for advice and consent on fixed-term mayoral appointments to boards and commissions, but not to any major single-headed executive department. That commission, chaired by a Republican state senator, found that they should be left to the mayor's discretion because it would interfere with the mayor's ability to run his own departments. Repeated city council speakers and city council members have encouraged numerous commissions from 1989 to the present to broadly expand advice and consent. Only 2 have answered that call. Of course, the 1989 commission granting it for the Commission of Investigation at the advice of Powell Pierpont, who was then the chair of the Board of Ethics, now the COIB, and then the 2019 commission, which, despite the council asking for fixed terms and advice and consent for the commissioners or directors of the NYPD, City Planning, Oath, CFB, and COIB, went with the Corp Council, which actually had been Speaker Quinn's request in 2010, because the Corp Council's unique role and legal obligation to both the city and the council. And it also should be noted that the list found in Charter Section 31 is actually not exhaustive, right? The council now exercises advice and consent of a local conditional release commission, which it created in 2020 and pursuant to the corrections law, and I'm acknowledging that Keith Powers, the chair of that legislation, is here, has that authority there. And Speaker Adams is actually in a long line of distinguished members that have held her position to seek this, right? Starting with Vice Chair and then Speaker Vallone, who introduced legislation in the 1980s, 90s, throughout. Hearings were held. They did not always make it across. They did engender some opposition, but this is not a new concept, and that's what I want to sort of make sure to leave people with there. Recognizing the shortness of time, I'm just going to summarize. People have talked about how unique New York City is nationally, but actually New York City is unique in the state. Albany, Yonkers, Rochester, Buffalo each do advice and consent, as do, I'm going to say, about 12 counties. I have them all listed here by name, but I can't do the math quickly. And then, for the sake of the diminishing time, I'm just going to quickly note that my written submission discusses both legal concerns about certain enumerated positions and logistical concerns placed upon the council for consideration, and proposes several interventions, including legislation pertaining to the mayoral committee on appointments and the diffusion of council consideration among more committees to address these matters. I also discuss, and I'm happy to address in response to questions, the proposed different limitations of selection of acting commissioners and the provisions of the municipal home rule law that limit any council bill passed between now and the fall to November 2024 or 2025 ballots. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the past 25 or 250 years.
Thank you very much. I imagine we'll have a good number of questions for you. I'd like to offer our public advocate the opportunity to make a statement, and then we'll turn over the speaker for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Sheldon Brown, Assembly Member, Public Advocate, for being here and sharing remarks. I just wanted to be present to share my support of what the council is doing. Thank the Speaker and the Chair. I think it's long overdue. Having been a council member myself, as many of you have, this city has the strongest majority probably in the country. I think many people know that. I don't think it lends itself to allowing the council to provide the counterweight that it should. And I just want to thank the Speaker again for doing the best that she can with the tools that exist. I do think providing that balance will be a lot more helpful, and getting advice and consent on the commissioners doesn't mean that they report to the council. They still report to the mayor and still function as such. And the council itself can't provide any advice, can't provide names. All they can do is say yea or nay. Having been here as well, I haven't seen too many times when advice and consent hasn't been here. And actually, the times that there's been discussion has only helped make things better. It is done all over the country, as people have mentioned, in cities, the state, the federal government. If it wasn't a process that helped, I think that we would not see it happening all over. And so I do wish that the Department of Education, which I know the city is creature of the state, and the NYPD were included, so hopefully that might be something that we can think about going forward. But in terms of providing the balance that the constituents want the council to do and often don't understand, they don't have the tools to do, this is a very much important step in the right direction. I guess I can see why the mayor and the supporters may be opposed to it, but it doesn't mean that it is right for good government. And so my hope is that we can get this passed, and we can get the people of the city to vote on it. It is very important to provide the type of balance of power that the constituents need from us, and it actually provides some very good conversations on whether candidates who are being appointed to these positions at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Public Advocate. Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all being here this morning. We do appreciate it. I'm going to just pose this question generally, and anyone or all can answer. Do you believe that the public should have the right to weigh in on advice and consent when it comes to the appointment of commissioners?
May I believe the public has a right to weigh in, and I believe they do on Election Day. And they exercise that power throughout the 4-year period by, in various ways, organizing, marching, demonstrating, coming to testify at different hearings, writing, calling, and so forth. So, but, the problem is I can foresee somebody with perfect qualifications for whatever the agency may be, and be denied, not on the qualifications, but they could have personal beef with a council member or two. It could be something that has nothing to do with government, nothing to do with integrity, nothing to do with the qualifications, but simply the fact that somebody does not like them. You know that, and I know that, and that's a problem that we would encounter.
I'm just going to say that, again, as I said in my opening statement, that this council has approved 35 candidates under this current administration, and we do take this responsibility very, very seriously. The expansion, and we do consider this a minute expansion, by the way.
I differ.
Well, you can.
I think this is big.
You can differ. You can differ. I'm just telling you my opinion. All right. We consider this, I consider this, a minute expansion of over 80 roles that we could have put into this existing bill. All right. With that minute entry of these commissioners, I dare say once again that the purpose of these oversight hearings is to hear the candidates, is to be able to question in depth the candidates, and also give the public the opportunity to exercise their opinions regarding the all candidates as well. All of that information is taken into advisement before the council comes up with a decision, a vote, if you will. So the contention that a beef with a council member would impact greatly, and we're talking about a commissioner here overseeing tremendous work for our city. I do take issue with it. I'm not saying that you are incorrect, because everybody's a human being and feelings do come into all of what we do. But once again, when it comes to the appointments of commissioners and the approval, which has always gone in the affirmative for this current administration, I do beg to differ. Mr. Chilton Brown.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to say I absolutely support the public being able to weigh in on advice and consent. My two reservations would be thus, again, you're proposing 21 offices. There are others that members of the council, members of the public have identified they also want to see, and having to repeatedly return. And another thing I would point out is that the council, including, for instance, the Department of Veteran Services is a relatively new agency. I believe Councilmember Ulrich passed in 2016, 2017. So again, as we create more entities having to potentially return to the public, and the issue of mayoral appointments is not only restricted to these commissioners, but the council in the past has suffered litigation losses around the Independent Police Investigation Audit Board and others because the council cannot create new entities that have representation from other than the mayor. So I absolutely support the public weighing in, but I think that there may also be opportunities and exploration about how to not ask the public each time the council wants to reset. In this minute way, I agree, that balance, or each time the mayor reorganizes government to make sure it encompasses the properly named institutions.
Ms. Gottfeld, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just caution everybody about the number of people and the number of institutions and organizations that would weigh in on all of this. And I'm not saying that isn't good, but I think it will create, as Assemblyman said, my colleague over here, it would just create a layer of bureaucracy that is going to be very, very difficult to cut through. And I fear for that. And as I said earlier, I don't quite understand what the council member said about the deputy commissioner. A deputy commissioner is appointed by the Parks Committee. I'm talking about parks now, by the Parks Committee. And if in fact that commissioner appoints a deputy commissioner who will be running the agency while this, I think, very long process, and I don't know how you implement a time restriction on it, and I think that's an interesting point to discuss. I just feel that that allows the last commissioner to have far more say in what goes on than you might want. And I just see that as a potential big, big gridlock. Creating a gridlock, excuse me.
Thank you very much. I just have one more question for the three, or anyone if you'd like to answer this. Do any of you anticipate that requiring advice and consent of the council would change who a mayor would nominate for any of the commissioner positions? Louis?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say yes. I mean, but I do not think that that is a bad thing, right? I mean, I actually happen to believe the 21 individuals holding these offices right now are all esteemed public servants in one way or another, but I only have to look at the end of the previous administration to see several individuals who succeeded long-term commissioners who, for one reason or another, chose not to stay till the end of 21, that were replaced by people from inside the mayor's orbit or donors and the like, in a way that I do not think any of them ever acted untowardly. None of this is meant to disparage any of their records, but I do not necessarily think that they had a record of work in that area that would have sustained questioning, or that they had a vision for those several months that they would be there. So again, I definitely think it would change it. I do not think it would change it on the whole, but I think that extra layer, whether it's through this or as I talk about a committee of appointment process for certain other positions, I think is a net gain for the city.
Thank you.
I also agree that yes, it might change the appointment process, but I do think it's a bad thing. If you don't allow the mayor to appoint his first choice for sanitation commissioner, how can you hold him accountable for picking up the garbage? If you don't allow the mayor to quickly fill in a vacancy at the Department of Health, how can you expect them to handle the COVID emergency at the time? So yes, it would change, and I think that's a bad thing.
Thank you. Mr. Chair?
Mr. Powell, I imagine you've reviewed the bill. You've said that you think it would create gridlock. How long does the council have in this proposed legislation to approve an appointment?
30 days?
30 days. So 30 days for a Department of Youth and Community Development Commissioner to be reviewed, vetted, screened, hold a public hearing, and approved. You think it would create gridlock if there was a 30-day window for oversight of a commissioner appointment?
Yeah, and perhaps bureaucracy is a better, description. Sure, it adds another level of bureaucracy when you could be doing other better and more important things.
To ensure that we have highly credible, vetted, experienced candidates, you think bureaucracy outweighs it?
Yes.
Yes.
Bureaucracy is more important than ensuring that we have competent,
Bureaucracy is
ethical
less-
people serving our administration?
Right, yes, absolutely.
Okay, it's an interesting perspective.
At the end of the day, just to finish.
Sure.
At the end of the day, the mayor is accountable on election day, and prior to that, by various hearings and demonstrations and letters and other constituent.
This legislation still ensures that the mayor is appointing each and every key position in his administration, correct?
Each and every
Key position in his administration is appointed by the mayor, correct?
Right
This
now it
legislation does not change who is appointed to serve in these
Well,
roles. Is that
may
correct?
change,
Yes or no?
he just mentioned, it may change who he will appoint if he has to receive the advice and consent.
Right, and it's a national best practice utilized at the state and federal level and other large cities around the country because it leads to more ethical and competent people serving in our
We
in
want to
public
mirror
service.
ourselves after Washington, D.C.?
Well, you served in Albany.
Yeah.
What positions are subject to advice and consent in the state legislature? What governor appointments are subject to advice and consent in the state legislature?
Many go through the Senate, the state
Yes.
Senate.
Every single department head in the state of New York. Do you think that's caused bureaucracy and gridlock?
It changes things. And here in the
Did it
city
cause
of New York, we
chaos
don't
and
have it.
gridlock and bureaucracy
It does
as you've
create
testified
bureaucracy.
today?
It does create bureaucracy.
Did you do anything to introduce legislation to modify
No,
the
I
advice
did
and
not.
consent process? No. In fact, in your last 5 years, I believe, in the state legislature from 2005 to 2010, you reportedly didn't introduce a single bill. Is that correct?
That has nothing to do with the legislation.
I'm interested in
I'm just saying, that
your-
has nothing to do with advice and consent, the city council over mayor.
Well, you expressing concern about advice and consent,
Yes,
but you didn't do anything to address advice and consent in the state legislature.
State Senate is the one that advises and consents.
As an assembly member, you have the ability to put forward legislation to recalibrate the advice and consent process.
All right?
Okay. And in the city council, you served during Giuliani's first term. Did you introduce a single bill in the city council during
Not on
Giuliani's
advice
first
and
term?
consent, it wasn't needed.
Or on any other topic?
Sure.
It looks like from 1994 to 1997, according to council records, you introduced 0 bills and co-sponsored 2.
Okay, that is not true, but I didn't come here to discuss my political history.
Well, it's relevant. You're testifying before us.
Advice and consent, the city council.
Well, so somebody's background would be considered during an advice and consent process. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you?
And again, that's part of the problem. You may consider somebody who is perfectly qualified for a position, but you may not like one or two
So you
positions he has
do not
taken.
believe that advice and consent would provide an independent review of a nomination?
It would add a level of bureaucracy that I don't think is needed. We need to streamline the process
Streamline the process. We need to streamline the process.
of mayoral appointments, or keep it as it is.
Are you advocating for a further streamlining of the process of mayoral appointments?
No, to keep it as is.
Okay. And you've testified on the record that a 30-day period would be too long and create gridlock, bureaucracy, chaos.
It just may bring a different nominee as versus the nominee the mayor may have had in mind.
Yeah.
And yes, it would add another level of bureaucracy, even if it's only 30 days.
Do you believe that the ethics and background of a nominee are relevant to whether they should serve?
Of course.
Of course.
But as I stated before, it may not be the level of qualifications of the nominee. It could be personal with a council member.
Yeah.
It could be personal with the chair of a committee.
What in your
Personal with a speaker.
Okay. In your time serving in the council, can you recall a specific example of that occurring and it being a hindrance to preventing a qualified
And that was
nominee from coming
32
forward?
years ago, and we did not have advice and consent. But yes, there were many personal.
There was advice and
personal
consent for a
situations.
dozen agencies between
There were many
1992 and
personal
1997.
situations, yes.
Give us an example of when it
don't
was a
recall right
hindrance. It exists for a dozen agencies in city government. You served in the state legislature for nearly a decade. Could you cite one specific example on the record today for when it was a hindrance and caused, in your words, gridlock,
No.
chaos, and bureaucracy?
No.
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 Okay. So despite serving in elected office for 15 odd years in city and state government, you cannot, and the advice and consent being widely utilized at the state level and utilized narrowly at the city level for dozens of appointments, you cannot cite a single example of it being a hindrance, an obstacle. No. Okay. Thank you very much. I will come back to ask questions of other witnesses, but we'll kick it to Councilmember Gennaro, followed by Councilmember Powers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a certain question in mind when I signed up to ask questions of this panel. I've kind of pivoted since then, and I think what I had on my mind was addressed by the speaker and the chair. But let me just speak from my own personal experience. People can make comments to this or whatever. I've been in, I started in city government in 1983 under Mayor Koch on the executive side, came over to the council in 1990, and have served the council for 27 years or 28 years combined as a member and as a member of the central staff. And all my time in city government, and I also used to teach state and local government at Queens College or whatever, so I supposedly know a little bit about that, aside from my experience being here. Is that one of the phenomena that has always gotten to me, and every mayor has a little bit of it, which is hubris. And the fact that the administration couldn't see fit to testify at this hearing today and engage with the council on this important issue, I think is the most compelling testimony that we could ever have as to why we need to establish ourselves as the partner in government and not be dismissed by the executive, which has been happening from Koch through today, in my experience, as much as I loved, many of those mayors. And so I think that speaks for itself. Every mayor wants to dismiss the council. Every mayor wants to say that the council is up to no good, that the council has, motives and whatnot that are something different than good government. And I think this is an insult to the council. And the fact that the administration couldn't bring itself here today to say one word about this bill is the most compelling testimony for this bill that I can possibly think of. That's my statement. Anyone feel free to comment to that.
I'd like to just express how strongly I support Councilmember Gennaro's statement on the record. Councilmember Powers.
Sure. Thank you for all your testimony. I'm sorry I missed some of it. I was actually taking a school class around City Hall. I think I can understand reasonably why there would be concerns from the administration about allowing the council to have more advice and consent power and how that might lead to potentially blocking or stopping certain appointments. I would note that the history so far in the city council, I'm the rules chair, has been pretty, obviously there's relevant examples right now, but pretty contrary to that point, which is that the council has approved almost, actually to date, every single appointee that's come before us in the city council. We've been held hearings on all of them that had required advice and consent and have approved them, and I think had the standard of people that have come through us have been very high, and those qualified people have had their hearing and have had the opportunity to present their credentials and answer questions, relevant questions, and we've approved every single one so far. And when there are contentious examples, they will go through the process reasonably to have to do the same process as others. But I think you're all presenting different, cases for and against, and lots of history from Lewis, and I think we can all understand the debate and where it exists. I did want to ask a question because one of the main points against adding advice and consent is around additional bureaucracy, additional red tape and approval processes that would exist. And I'm sensitive to it from the standpoint of timing with a new administration coming in, how you might have to handle all these advice and consent hearings in short order. I'm sensitive to that as the chair of that, of course. But the point about added bureaucracy, slowing down the process, things like that, those also seem to exist in the current, what's not happening here, but what's happening in my district at the Roseville House, which is that we are potentially going to end up in a process where we're going to have a charter commission that's going to recommend and advise and ask the voters to vote on processes which will significantly slow down the city council's ability to vote on legislation, make considerations around the budget, things like that. They may end up being really great ideas. They may be ideas we all hate, but it certainly seems a similar thing is in play here, which is we are going to end up in a thing that will significantly add more bureaucracy to the duly elected officials of city council to represent their constituents and make decisions. It feels like those arguments prevail, and it could prevail. For the folks who have raised these bureaucracy concerns, do you have similar concerns when it comes to that process and how that might slow down legislative processes and budgetary processes here at the City Council?
I mean, I'll start with a comment about advice and consent and privilege to that. I just want to note that though I talk about, I think there could potentially be, a plethora of appointments at a given time, and I think that poses actually some unique hurdles for you as the chair, but I don't think for the process. Laura Kavanaugh, who I'll identify because I think she's a distinguished individual, was not officially appointed fire commissioner until October of 22, right? Laura served as first deputy commissioner and acting commissioner for 10 months. She did so ably, and there was no bureaucratic hurdle. The DYCD commissioner was also appointed in the month of April and the like. So the mayor's process often moves quite slowly. And while if this legislation had been in effect in 2022, the council would have been called upon to approve 12 commissioners by the end of March. The council approved 2 plus 2 members of the Conflict of Interest Board in that time quite well. And so there is no bureaucratic standstill from those 30 days. Again, currently acting commissioners often serve quite longer than that. And again, to name a few, I think were quite distinguished. Margaret Forgione, who of course is now the first deputy commissioner. Axiris Barbeau, the Department of Health, who was the Baltimore Health Commissioner, had already led a major department. Sandra Bellis, who's now the executive deputy controller at TCWP. So all of that, I think, those concerns, I think, on the record are unfounded. That having been said, I do think, one has to see what I will call the Shashura Commission, because I like to call them all by their chairs' names in honor of Dick Ravitch and Fred Schwartz, comes up with, but certainly the proposal that was brought to the mayor by some of the individuals who are now on that commission, which seems to functionally be every single piece of public safety legislation has to go through all 59 community boards, is what I would call a boondoggle.
Other folks want to add any comments on that?
I mean, the issue of the 30 days and the added level of bureaucracy is one concern. I think a bigger concern is what was outlined before, whereby a mayor could maybe appoint somebody or nominate somebody else rather than his first or second choice. I think that's a bigger concern as well.
And I just go back to the idea of the deputy commissioner running the agency. Appointed by whom? Again, think about parks. When I came into parks, there was a structure in there that was pretty good, although it was very, very political. And frankly, had I not been there to kind of change some things around, I'm not sure that it would have been the kind of thing that you all would want. And again, I don't want to get into personalities. It's more structure of how it's going to work, one. And two, I just see the whole issue of community involvement, which is very important. And by the way, as Parks Commissioner, the thing that you do the most is listen to the community as much as you possibly can, because everybody has an opinion and they're very, very strong about their opinions. And you got to figure out, and that's one of the things you're appointed for. But I really feel that it's going to take an enormous amount of time to get these things straightened out. And just looking at what you said about the 30 days or the 30 whatever, I just think it's a nightmare.
Yeah, and just for the record, I was raising the possibility. I think Louis, his answer provided also a lot of insight into exactly how you can time that process out and the process for setting up an administration that might take time anyway to get to everyone to the approval process. So I understand some of the concerns. I think they're also resolvable.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Powers. Ms. Gottbaum, just a couple questions for you and then a couple questions for Mr. Cholden Brown. Corp Counsel was subjected to advice and consent following the Charter Revision Commission of 2018-2019. It led to the appointment of the first 2 women to lead Corporation Counsel, distinguished, qualified women of color, Georgia Pestana and Judge Sylvia Hines-Radix. Do you believe that that subjecting Corp Counsel to advice and consent has caused any negative issues, or do you think that was a positive development?
I think it's a positive development. I think, yes, I think it's a positive development, and I think because Corporation Counsel represents the council, you want to make sure that the person that is appointed to that position is strong and will be fair in terms of both the council and the mayor. To me, that's a very important issue, and therefore, yes, the answer to your question is I do think that was a good.
And as we discussed at a recent hearing on the mayor's new form policy requiring elected officials to fill out a form to engage with city agencies that he reviews and approves, we referenced a section of the charter that notes agency heads shall have cognizance and control of the government, administration, and discipline of their agencies. Does this indicate that agency heads have a certain independence from the mayor in your perspective and are intended to run their agencies based on their own professional expertise?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Yes, I do think that the commissioners are appointed with that in mind, that they have their own autonomy, and I think that was very clear in the administration that I had the pleasure to serve alongside. We got into many fights about that kind of thing, because if a commissioner was being very responsive to me as public advocate, again, I hate to personalize this, but it's hard not to, and that was not good, or that was not allowed by the executive. It caused a big problem. On the other hand, the relationship that one develops with people, you get it done anyway. And
you've referenced concern about the interim process that we would have.
Yes, I'm very concerned about that.
So if an agency head were to resign, would take over as an interim if that position exists, don't you think that that would help ensure that City Hall and the commissioner of the agency want to have really strong first deputy commissioners in place who are prepared to step in as necessary if the commissioner is no longer able to serve?
No, I see it as different when you have elected a mayor and then that process has taken too long to advise and consent or create advise and consent for the commissioner, and then the current deputy commissioner is in charge. That's the old administration running the agency, and perhaps that wouldn't work out with the current mayor. You don't know, and I just don't see that as a good possibility. I mean, frankly, again, I don't want to get personal, but that did happen when I became Parks Commissioner.
Well, but if the council only has 30 days to review, hold the hearing, and approve an appointment after the council has received an appointment, do you think that process should be streamlined further, that's not adequately?
I do.
What would you recommend?
I would recommend not having, first of all, I would not do it as quickly as it has been done now. I think you need a little bit more time to look into all these things in much more detail. And I think that is a question that immediately that I could not be able to answer. I don't believe in all cases that the council would be able to get it done in 30 days.
That is our current practice that is the current practice of the council for advice and consent. When people are nominated for the Taxi and Limousine Commission or the Art Commission or Public or Landmarks Preservation Commission, there's 30-day window once the nomination is received to hold a hearing, chaired by our Rules Committee Chair, who just departed, Councilmember Powers, and for the council team to do the necessary vetting and review for a nomination. That, to me, feels like an expedited process, a swift process, very different than what we see in Washington, for example, where we don't, where the Senate can be slow. The council works very quickly and would work very quickly under these expanded authorities in this bill.
Well, I don't know if that's true. You're talking about an enormous number of agencies. I mean, if you're just talking about these ones that were stated in the legislation, I just don't see you be able to do it that quickly for all of them. I just don't. I mean, sort of practically speaking, if you have various people understanding that they can be a part of advised consent, how are you going to avoid all of those people having a voice in what you're doing? It's a little bit different if you have the whole city, right?
Right. Just to be clear, if in the Speaker's proposed legislation, if the council failed to act within 30 days, the appointment takes effect. So that's the time frame for how it would work. Having seen the council's lawyers up close, and their partnership with DOI, I'm confident that this is a process with some expanded capacity that could be done on an aggressive time frame that is laid out in this legislation. But I think we've heard in the testimony today both critiques that it's too fast and that it's too slow. And so maybe for Goldilocks purposes, we got it just right. So I will just ask Mr. Cholden-Brown just a question or two, if that's okay, and then if my colleagues have any further questions. Oh, and I failed to acknowledge my neighbor and friend, Councilmember Crystal Hudson. I'd like to ask about the 1989 nominees, the City Planning Commission nominees to advice and consent. And I believe the rationale from the documents that we've reviewed was that it shouldn't just be all appointments by the mayor, and that the input of the council and the appointments from other stakeholders were valued and valuable. Do you think that same logic should apply to other agencies in city government and for other appointments?
Yeah, so I mean, the creation of the current City Planning Commission actually was very fraught, right, dating back to '87 when Dick Ravitch started his commission. Through the end of the Schwartz Commission in '89, there actually was something called the Land Use Commission for a long time, and those proposals that would have been a 7-member body with actually some direct council appointments at various times, but obviously there was a very deliberate and robust debate between, Chair Schwartz, other luminaries like Nat Leventhal, Judah Gribbetts, David Traeger, all of whom had long government careers in one sort or another. So, it ended where it did, but certainly I think that logic follows through to this day. I would absolutely agree.
And from your perspective, across the 12 or so agencies that do have appointments that are subject to advice and consent, many of which have been in place for 50 years since the '75 Charter Revision Commission, can you note any significant problems or hindrances that have been caused by the advice and consent process?
No. Again, I mean, I think one thing that is notable is that commissioners on the boards and commissions serve until the appointment of their successor, right? Which I think obviously obviates against vacancies, though vacancies do, of course, occur. But to my knowledge, in those 50 years, no commission has ever failed to achieve a quorum because of the time period. And again, 30 days is a very rapid period. I must admit, I come down on the side that it should be a little bit longer. Albany does 45 at various points. Speaker Vallone sought 60, but at no point has the Art Commission, LPC, TLC, or any of the others suffered because of advice and consent, even when under unfortunate circumstances, a nominee has had to withdraw and the process has re-begun. So no, I think it's not been a hurdle.
And this may be a question for you or Ms. Gottbaum, if you could. When the mayor plans to or considers appointing a person for a high-level post, they undergo a Department of Investigation background check, correct? If DOI's background check identifies significant issues for any commissioner appointment, they're often, the public, the council, most the overwhelming number of people who work in city government have no awareness whatsoever of any flags or concerns, ethical or otherwise, that may appear in that DOI background check. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
far
think
as
that's
I know.
yeah.
We would have no idea. And for those of us who have, and if, but we do know, of course, that there are significant issues in people's background checks. But it's up to the mayor to just make the decision to appoint that person anyway or not.
Well, so I mean, I think that the decision to appoint is definitely with the mayor alone. I would note, of course, that in certain circumstances, COIB waivers are required subsequent to appointment, and there is a little bit of additional transparency in that regard. But certainly that does not preclude anyone from taking the post if they're willing to jump through the hoops or forego pay or whatever other contrived process.
And if the mayor's not concerned about the ethical issues
Right,
that were raised in the background check. But if the candidate were subject to advice and consent, could you explain how that would work in the city council process?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly I think that the Appointments and Investigations Unit has a long history of strong collaboration with DOI, as well as doing its own investigations, not only on these appointments, but actually all appointments that are made by the council or by the speaker pursuant to law, museum bylaws, or the other. So, I mean, the council has a very strong record there of identifying things of, nominees have to fill out questionnaires and all, and those things are either placed upon the record if it's deemed appropriate, or private conversations and letters securing people's agreements to either resign from conflicts or otherwise address a potential concern are obtained and shared with the committee as appropriate before a vote is taken. So there's a very robust process that the council engages in those 30 days to make sure that any ethical hurdles are identified and ameliorated.
And I just want to ask one more question of you. In reference to comments that were made by Mayor Adams over the weekend, where he said, if my team were to come to me and say, Eric, you should approve the committee chairs of the city council, I will say, no, I will not do that. The speaker needs her chairs to carry out the overall agenda. My chairs are my commissioners. I would not go into the city council and determine who's the public safety chair, who's the housing chair, who's the land use chair, because that is just wrong for me to determine the direction that the speaker of the city council would like to go. I found those comments baffling, and I was wondering, from your experience working in the council, have you experienced this mayor and other mayors weighing in on speakers' races and on specific committee chair personship?
There has never been an instance where I have not known that to happen. But I also am going to note that
that was a lot of double negatives. Would you mind doing that one in reverse for us?
Sorry? Yes. I mean, every mayor has weighed in on the speaker's race, except for Giuliani. He was stuck with Peter Vallone, and certainly committee chairs. And I will acknowledge that some speakers, certainly in the 90s, let us say, were responsive to those pressures, including even midway through a term. The other thing I wanted to note, though, quickly is the mayor misconceives how committee chairs are appointed, right? Certainly, the speaker has a very large role in that, but this is a process that the temporary rules committee or the permanent rules committee, depending on the time, participates in, and ultimately the chairs are ratified by the council. For a committee chair to be removed requires a 2/3 vote of the council. It is not a unitary process, and so it actually very much resembles a vice consent process where every member of the council is actually a part of determining who chairs which committee.
That's very insightful. Thank you for clarifying that. I do not have any further questions for this panel. We're good? Councilmember Brewer, are you good?
No, I have a question.
Councilmember Brewer, go for it.
Thank you.
Oh, and then Palladino, excuse me.
I did hear Jim Karras point out other cities. They're not as large, but Chicago has the same number of elected in the city council as New York. Smaller city, just as many members of the city council, advice and consent. So my question is, it seems to me that every single time somebody comes within the 30-day period, that it is good to have sunshine on that individual, to see for the public that that individual is qualified. And I know from friends in Chicago that they like the process. So my question to you is, do you think that this process, despite the challenge of the numbers of people that would have to be certified quickly, do you not think all of you being understanding the importance of open meetings law, sunshine on government, do you not think that this would be another example of having that kind of sunshine so that the public knows where their dollars are going for X number of agencies? Chicago, it works.
Yes.
Adam?
Thank you. No, I think another point that has not been brought up is this process of advice and consent may actually discourage very qualified individuals from participating, be it because they have some personal issues that may be embarrassing, although has nothing to do with their integrity or their qualifications professionally, but again, they may be discouraged from even applying, or they may have personal beef with a chair of a committee or the speaker of council members.
I would tell them to get the hell out of the job, Adam.
I understand. It politicizes the process.
Okay. Betsy?
I will agree with my colleague over here. I think he's right, and I can cite, excuse me, personal experience along those lines. Again, there was no advice and consent when I was named Parks Commissioner, but had there been, I don't think I ever would have been Parks Commissioner.
Why?
Because everybody said she's never had anything to do with parks. She's not an environmentalist. Environmentalist has nothing to do with how you run the Parks
I
Department.
think you would have been appointed, Betsy Gobbound.
I don't think.
All right.
You'll never know. You know what, Gail? Let me just say, not an environmentalist, and there were a lot of environmentalists who were pushed forward by many good-hearted people. Parks is a management job. It's picking up the garbage and cutting the grass.
I'm aware.
And if I may, I think we all agree she served admirably as Parks Commissioner.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
I certainly would have voted for your appointment. Councilmember Palladino.
Good morning. You keep bringing up Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was probably one of the best mayors this city has ever had. Whether you agree with me or not, that's okay. I do believe this is an overreach of the city council once again. You know, we have a mayor, we elected a mayor, and it seems that we're very eager to destroy the separations of powers in this city and regulate the entire mayorship to simply a ceremonial position, simply because we don't like his appointments. I mean, I'm not understanding this. I see this as a genuine overreach. Elections mean living with the decisions that the voters have made. And New York, that means our mayor gets to appoint commissioners of his choosing. It's as simple as that. This is nothing more, to me, than a power grab by this city council. And and as far as I go, it would lock in a progressive control over this entire city, nullify the mayoral elections, and frustrate any future attempts at reforming the city by this or any other future mayor. With all the problems that this city is facing, the city council majority should be reflecting deeply on how we got here and what could be done to fix things, not engaging in dangerous political games with the mayor like this. I think it's ridiculous. And you cite Chicago like we're going to hold Chicago up, one of the worst cities in this country, and we're going to hold up Los Angeles, one of the worst cities in this country, as an example of what happens when we turn over control to the city council? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I totally disagree with this, and I really hope that we all come to our senses. And that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you very much. I would underscore for the record that checks and balances are enshrined in our Constitution. They exist at every level of government, in most large municipalities, the state level, federal level, and I think they have it has worked quite well. With that, we will excuse this panel. Thank you all for joining us today. And why don't we go here first? We'll next hear from a member of the public, followed by a representative of the administration who has joined us after all, so thank you. Before the member of the public testifies, I am just going to share a brief statement. I remind members of the public that this is a formal government proceeding and that decorum shall be observed at all times. As such, members of the public shall remain silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from the witness table. Further, members of the public may not present audio or video recordings as testimony, but may submit transcripts of such recordings to the Sergeant at Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. If you wish to speak at today's hearing, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant of Arms and wait to be recognized. When recognized, you will have 3 minutes to speak on today's hearing topic, the elected official agency engagement request form. You will have 3 minutes to speak on today's topic, Intro 908. If you have a written statement or additional written testimony you wish to submit for the record, please provide a copy of that testimony to the Sergeant at Arms. You may also email written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of this hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. Once again, for those of you who are testifying in person and register in advance, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant of Arms. For panelists on Zoom, once your name is called, a member of our staff will unmute you and the Sergeant of Arms will give you the go-ahead to begin upon setting the timer. Please wait for the Sergeant to announce you that you may begin before delivering your testimony. I would now like to invite Ms. Sharon Brown to testify, and we'll do a second panel followed by Ms. Tiffany Raspberry. Ms. Brown, did we lose her? Okay. She's coming over now. Ms. Brown, you're invited to testify.
Okay, can you give me a rundown of what this one is about? I have so many hearings, sorry.
Okay, this one is Intro 908, introduced by our speaker, Ms. Adrienne Adams, and this bill would subject additional appointments of the mayor to advice and consent of the City Council. 21 agency heads would be required to be submitted to the council, where we'd hold a vote to ratify their nominations or reject them.
Okay, so you have
Would you mind just pressing the button in front of you so we can hear you, and to remind you you're on the clock, so you have a limited amount of time.
Okay, I believe that they should have a vetting process of 30 days, and when you can find the proper information of a candidate for 30 days, it should be fine. But there should be an addendum that if you don't get to vet the person properly, that an additional time should be added. So that should be a part of the bill. So if you can get it done in 10 days or whatever days, you don't have to fill that 30 days up. It can be as far as you can find out enough information about the candidate. So if it's within the 30 days, you can move on unless you want to just dig more to make sure you got everything. The 30-day allotment is proper. Just make sure that you add more time. It should be in the bill that if for some reason you can't find the information that you seek, you should get an extended amount of time, maybe another 30 days, and maybe you can extend it and have some kind of delay or something on the appointment. If you can't get the proper information, they shouldn't just go in if you can't get the information or there's conflicting information. Thank you. Sharon Brown.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much, Ms. Brown. It is now my pleasure to ask Ms. Tiffany Raspberry to come up and testify. And we will have to swear her in? Okay. And as a member of the administration, you do need to be sworn in, so I'll defer to my committee counsel.
Thank you. Would you please raise your right hand? Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee and respond honestly to council member questions? Thank you. You may begin.
If you wouldn't mind just pressing the button so we can hear you.
Of course. Thank you very much. You'd think I'd be a pro by now. Good morning.
Good to have you back before the Government Operations Committee.
Speaker Adams, Chair Ressler, Councilmember Gennaro, Councilmember Brewer, it's a pleasure to sit here before you this morning. While we were never formally invited to participate in the hearing, I want to take an opportunity to address some of the claims that were made today that were said otherwise, specifically from you, Chair Ressler. I will not be taking questions since we were not invited and I did not have time to prepare. For the record, we are opposed to this legislation. We are focused on what New Yorkers care about most: bringing down crime, cleaning up our streets, and improving quality of life. This statement I'm about to read is from the mayor and was supposed to be submitted as written testimony. Again, Speaker Adams, Chair Ressler, and members of the Committee on Governmental Operations, State and Federal Legislation. I am submitting this testimony as mayor of the City of New York to express my concerns regarding Intro 908, which would require the advice and consent of the City Council for 21 city commissioners. As you know, the mayor of New York City has had the sole authority to appoint commissioners and agency heads since 1884, for 140 years, and for good reason. In March of 1884, then Governor Grover Cleveland signed a bill into law placing the responsibility to appoint agency heads solely with the mayor. Governor Cleveland issued a signing statement emphasizing that the principles of good government required this change because New Yorkers are best served by vesting the power of appointment only in the mayor, who is elected by all the people in the municipality, quote, not by dividing or sharing that power with legislators who are, quote, responsible only to their constituents and their respective districts, end quote. Governor Cleveland further wrote, if the chief executive of the city is to be held responsible for its order and good government, he should not be hampered by any interference with his selection of subordinate administrative officers, and the plea should never be heard that a bad nomination had been made because it was only one that could secure confirmation. The real world impacts this legislation, if enacted, would have on every New Yorker across the 5 boroughs would be vast. And once you think about the proposal, you are quick to conclude that it would undoubtedly be bad for New Yorkers. Any uncertainty or delaying in appointing agency leadership creates a real possibility for harm from delay of delivery of services, from emergency management to senior services to healthcare continuity, to garbage collection and construction safety. This bill risks diminishing the city's ability to manage and respond to the service needs that we hear all from the public every day. Right now, we regularly experience significant delays in scheduling confirmation hearings for the relatively small number of nominees to even be considered by the council. As we have seen many times, major events have challenged the city such that the administrative political delays could have major negative impact on delivery of service and confidence of New Yorkers in their government. You only need to look back to the prior administration when the health commissioner resigned in the midst of the fight against COVID. Imagine taking several weeks or months to find a new commissioner to take their place, and the impacts of that vacuum on leadership and what it might have had to the staff of the agency or New Yorkers at large. On top of those risks, the politicization of the appointments process can only have many harmful implications for New York City's professional governance. While the city is able to attract some of the best talent to lead our agencies, there are significant sacrifices that those individuals make in order to serve New Yorkers, whether that is in the form of salary or work-life balance. Adding the uncertainty and potential for public spectacle of an advise and consent process to the list of sacrifices would seriously hamper the city's ability to attract and retain good talent. We have a clear example of how this process can be corrupted by politics when we look to our nation's capital and see a process where it is weaponized and politicized to score cheap political points, and that is a disservice to the American people. This legislation, we believe, would have the same impact on New Yorkers. And the mayor wanted me to add that he believes that it would be unconscionable for him to interfere in the speaker's process to decide on committee chairs and leadership of this body. Prior to 1884, the city experimented with a system where the city's legislators, known as the Board of Aldermen, confirmed the mayor's appointments. To put it plainly, the system proved to be bad government primarily because it induced a lack of accountability. Where there is no one clearly in charge and therefore no one who can clearly shoulder the blame, New Yorkers lose faith in government. This is precisely why the alderman system of confirming mayoral appointees was abandoned. In short, it was tried and failed, and the city moved decisively away from it in order to bring more accountability to city government and services. The mayor's power to appoint agency heads has remained intact since 1884. In fact, multiple charter review commissions have reinforced that this mayoral authority is critical to the mayor's ability to govern and to the people's ability to hold the mayor accountable at the polls. In 1975, for example, the commission found, quote, "It is the mayor whom the public holds accountable for city programs and services. With this responsibility must come authority to select those individuals who are to carry out executive policy. The role of city legislative bodies should be to evaluate and report on performance of the mayor's appointees," end quote. There are only 2 exceptions in all of New York city government for which the city council has advice and consent for non-board or commission agency head of appointments, for the commissioner of the Department of Investigations and the Corporation Council. The charter commissions for those, the charter commission said that those exceptions were made because of the very unique nature of those positions. The DOI commissioner is responsible for conducting investigations citywide, including as directed by the mayor or the council. Additionally, the council's recent charter commission distinguished the position of the Corporation Council because that position represents not just city agencies, but also the city council and comptroller. As such, for those 2 positions, exceptions were made in recognition of the uniqueness of the post. Lastly, the council already has significant checks on the mayor's powers, including budget, land use, and oversight. The council regularly holds oversight hearings, approves budgets, and legislates reporting requirements from city agencies. If there are ever shortcomings from any of those agencies, the council then holds those who have been appointed to do those jobs accountable. If for whatever reason the council feels that information they are seeking is not being produced, they also have the authority to subpoena the administration to compel us to comply or face legal sanctions by court. In other words, oversight from the council already exists. Expanding that oversight to having final say on the mayor's choice of who they want to lead agencies to carry out policies that New Yorkers that city voters elected them to carry out would be a disservice to New Yorkers for the reasons outlined throughout this testimony. I would ask that the council reflect on the experience and judgment of past governors, mayors, charter revision commissions, and others who have come to the same conclusion. This proposal is misguided. I urge you to reject this proposal if brought to a vote. I thank you for the opportunity to share my concerns with Intro 908. I know that both the administration and council have a shared commitment to good governance that is both reflective and responsive to the needs of all New Yorkers, one that is rooted in accountability and transparency to ensure public trust and advance the public good. Thank you.
Ms. Raspberry would like to ask you to take questions since you're here before us today.
I'm not prepared to take questions, but I want
The administration will not engage in good faith on this legislation?
I think that if you had formally invited us, as I mentioned at the beginning, we would
When
have
was
been
your office contacted
more-
about this hearing?
We read about it online on Thursday evening when it was noticed, and on Friday, my staff reached out to the Speaker's office, and we had a conversation with the staff where we explicitly asked if there was an expectation for us to testify at this hearing, and we were told that there was not. And so you sent a series of casual messages which were shared to me by my Director of City Legislative Affairs, but at no time did we receive in the traditional way in which the administration is invited to testify to hearings a formal invitation to testify at
The
this
administration is not required to receive a formal invitation to testify The hearing was noticed on Thursday. I contacted the city legislative affairs director contacted me on Thursday afternoon, and I asked who was testifying from the administration. At that time, we were advised that a representative from the law department may be coming before us. On Friday, the director of legislative affairs to the council was in communication with the Office of Legislative Affairs, inviting the administration to testify. You all have chosen not to come here and engage in good faith on this issue.
I believe that I'm familiar with the exchange you had with
I just wanted to clarify it on the
director,
record.
And he shared with me that you all were exchanging those messages in jest. And so now that we understand that you didn't take it that way, we'll be sure to make sure that anything that is shared in jest in a collegial manner, that we specify that that is the case.
I want to be clear. I don't generally engage in private text messages on the record, but you did.
I really appreciate you allowing me this opportunity to read the
I
mayor's
have to
testimony.
say, I think it's
and
very
I hope that
disappointing.
you have a great rest of the day.
I think it's
Thank you so
very
much,
disappointing,
Speaker
Ms. Raspberry, that you would come here and not engage in good faith and answer questions on legislation.
Thank you.
And especially when the testimony that you shared had some significant inaccuracies. I will offer Speaker Adams the opportunity for a statement while Ms. Raspberry is still here.
Thank you very much. This, to me, illustrates a contempt for this council, which we have all witnessed with great clarity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to just inform on the record that Ingrid Lewis Martin informed the Chief of Staff to the Speaker, was informed of this hearing by the Chief of Staff to the Speaker. The Mayor's senior advisor was informed by the Chief of Staff to the Speaker about this hearing. So there was multiple levels of communication with this administration requesting that they come and testify today, and their disdain and contempt for the council is noted on the record. I'd like to make a statement, but I will first offer the opportunity to Councilmember Gennaro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to be associated with the Speaker's remarks, and you're going to make a statement. I just feel compelled to put on the record that the characterizations that were made in the statement by the administration, I'm just reading from a little note that I made here. There was a characterization that it's like we, the council exists to score cheap political points. I don't see how those kind of comments can be put into a statement that is attributed to the mayor and put on the record here in this formal hearing. And if that doesn't amount to disrespect and hubris, I don't know what does. And with regard to the accuracy of the statement, there was a, and I'm not blaming Tiffany for this. She was giving something to read and she read it. That the mayor, it was attributed that he would never interfere in trying to have an impact on the council leadership, but everybody in New York City who's attuned to politics, on any level, understands that that is exactly what the mayor tried to do. Not the first mayor to try to do that, but he had his own desire of whom he wished to see as speaker. He did not win that contest, or whatever you want to call it. And so I just want to point out the factual inaccuracy and the hypocrisy of that part of the statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Gennaro. I will just offer my closing remarks. I am incredibly disappointed with the cowardice that has been displayed by the mayor and his administration today. Their inaccurate statements on the record and their refusal to take questions from this council is gravely disappointing. And this legislation proposed by our speaker would advance good governance in New York City, building on the success that we've had in a narrow manner with advice and consent, and on the broad application that advice and consent has had at the state and federal levels and with other large municipalities across the country. It establishes the critical accountability and oversight role of the council. And frankly, the display by the mayor's representative today underscores why the expansion of advice and consent authority is so urgently needed. I am very disappointed that an on-the-record statement from the mayor would be given that was clearly inaccurate, where they indicated that the mayor would never interfere on committee chairs. He interfered in our speaker's race a number of years ago, advocating for an alternative candidate, and pushed aggressively for specific people to get committee chair positions in this council. So that is wrong. It is just plain inaccurate. And I'd like to just clarify that if we were in a state of emergency, if an emergency declaration were declared, then of course the mayor could potentially expedite or use those emergency powers to advance an appointment process as necessary. The mayor also has the authority to work with agency heads to ensure that there are qualified, capable, competent, ethical people in first deputy commissioner positions to take over city agencies when a vacancy occurs. This process would ensure that we have competent, ethical, experienced people serving the city of New York. This administration has unfortunately not been the partner to this city council that New Yorkers expect. It undermines the efficacy of our government. It undermines our ability to get things done when this mayor fails to work with his counterparts in government. And I hope that today that will represent a turning point, because I don't know how we get any lower. Thank you very much for joining us today at this hearing.